that up to go right to you.
Before we get started, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. It's a wonderful experience and an opportunity for us to have Edward Wong with us. Much more about him to come. But my name is Glenn Osaki. I'm with the USC U.S.-China Institute. And we're really proud to present this program alongside the East Asian Studies Center. We have Grace Rue, who's here from EASC. We're also very pleased to have a couple of our executive committee members from the U.S.-China Institute, Stan Rosen from Dornsife and Eric Hekela from Price. We also have Joshua Shen, our State Department diplomat in residence for the Center on Public Diplomacy, and a number of other faculty that I see in the audience and students. So thank you all for being here today. I'm going to turn the microphone over to our very esteemed faculty member, Viet Nguyen, who's going to do an introduction for today's session before handing it over to our speakers. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Glenn. Hey, welcome everybody. It's such a pleasure for me to be here to introduce Edward Wong. He is a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, and he reports on global affairs, U.S. foreign policy, and the State Department. One of the more interesting things I found in his bio is that he has traveled to nearly 100 countries. That's sort of unimaginable. He writes on American foreign policy and its impact, as well as on the foreign policies of other nations, covering topics ranging from espionage to economic competition to environmental crises. Recently, he's focused on the multipolar world, authoritarian states, and wars and superpower rivalries involving the United States. He travels with the U.S. Secretary of State to report on how the United States conducts diplomacy while also trying to fulfill the mission of American journalism to hold power accountable. He's reported for the New York Times for more than 25 years, including nearly a decade as a China correspondent and the Beijing bureau chief. He's the author of the book we're going to talk about today, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China. It's an epic account of modern China that brings together a compelling family memoir with crucial reporting, toggling effortlessly between the epic and the intimate, according to The Atlantic. The son of Chinese immigrants in Washington, D.C., Edward grew up among family secrets. His father toiled in Chinese restaurants and rarely spoke of his native land or his years in the People's Liberation Army under Mao. Wakan Wong came of age during the Japanese occupation in World War II and the Communist Revolution, when he fell under the spell of Mao's promise of a powerful China. Edward's father's astonishing journey as a soldier took him from Manchuria during the Korean War to Xinjiang on the Central Asian frontier. In 1962, disillusioned with the Communist Party, he made plans for a desperate escape to Hong Kong. This is the basis for what the Wall Street Journal calls a sprawling, complex morality tale that sweeps us along. When Edward became the Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times, he investigated his father's mysterious past while assessing for himself the dream of a resurgent China. The Washington Post says that in telling this personal story about family memory, exile, and return, the book also takes in the breadth of China's evolution during the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Edward Wong as he talks about this groundbreaking and insightful book.
Thanks, Peter.
Good to see you. And actually, Ed, if you can just clip this on this other microphone.
This one right here?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to?
Let me get the hard sell out of the way. Worth your money, worth your time. It's an incredible journey. It's one that I feel very lucky to have traveled thanks to Edward Wong. This is a fantastic book. I have no question that when lists are created for the best China books of 2024, at the top. This will be at the top. This is an outstanding book. And Viet has already told us some of the stories, the broad sweep, and also teased a little bit of it. But there are a couple of things that we'd really like to explore with Ed. He's also prepared pictures, some of them from the book itself, and we'll see those in a little bit, okay? But first, we'll have some questions, and then we'll have questions from you folks. And at that point, we'll have a microphone, and we need you to use the microphone so that the camera can pick that up. All right? So, friends, thank you for carving out time to be with us. You're going to be richly rewarded. And again, I love this book. No question. This is a really remarkable story. And the first couple of questions that I have for you, Ed, involve just the mechanics of it, because the technique here is amazing. It's really astonishing. As has already been said, it's intensely personal and yet deeply researched, and it extends back centuries and a few minutes ago, right? So it covers this sweep of history and does it in an incredibly engaging way. I'm sure if I ask how long it took to write the book, he'll say that I got the book contract and 6 years later. That's not true. He's been working on this book throughout your adulthood, working, learning about his family and creating a document about it and then pursuing this deeply. It's an astonishing book. So the first question on the mechanical side, we have in the title of the book, at the edge of empire. An empire looms large throughout this book. Was there ever a time when you were putting this together where it wasn't an organizing principle? You go to Beijing, a grand empire, from Iraq,
Right.
among other places, where you saw a different kind of empire, but an empire nonetheless.
First, I wanted to say thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk. Thanks to Glenn for helping organize it, Clay for hosting and moderating, and then Viet for the great introduction. I think I've been influenced by several of the people in this room in my writings and my reporting, Viet's own writings on empire, America's imperial reach, and how wars, exile affect all of us, affect many, especially people from Asia who have migrated here to the US. And I think that's a central theme in here. Clay's studies on China have been very influential, and he and I have been on very important email discussions and listservs about China throughout the years. So thank you all for welcoming me. So when I set out to write the book, I had a couple of aims in mind, and one was I knew near the end of my time in China for the New York Times, which was coming up around 2016, I knew I wanted to write a book about China that summarized my decades-long engagement with the country, as you mentioned, Clay. And that began in my 20s, mainly when I went to grad school at Berkeley and studied Chinese history, politics, language. And it continued onward with a long break when I was working as a reporter in New York, and then Iraq, and then finally when I was posted to China and was able to live in the country for nearly a decade. So I wanted to summarize what I learned and seen about China, and the ideas that started to form in my head about what China is today and how it came to be. And I was thinking to myself, what's the best way to write a book for the lay reader that would be accessible to the lay reader and give them this broad sweep of Chinese history from the Mao era, 1950s, up until now. And I thought, there's a certain story that I had started to learn in my 20s. That was a story of my father as a member of Mao's army, posted out to the northwest frontier region, to Xinjiang, where he was part of the initial military occupation of Xinjiang, one that continues today and that we see in the headlines with the repression of the Uyghur Muslims out there, Kazakh Muslims. And my father was among the ethnic Han Chinese who were sent out there in PLA units to try and control the region, to disband Kazakh Muslim and Uyghur Muslim militias, and then to start the system of agricultural garrisons that would form the backbone of the control of Xinjiang for the Communist Party. So in knowing that personal story, I could not, ignore the fact that China is this imperial power. has an imperial reach well beyond the parts of interior China that people commonly think of as culturally Chinese. And that as I examine China more and more in the current day, in the contemporary era, that many of the forms of control that it had begun in my father's era and that my father had been part of extend well into the current day, and that there are even efforts at expansion into other borderlands beyond what we know as China today that Xi Jinping and his cohort are undertaking. As you mentioned, Clay, I was coming to China from having finished a stint in Iraq, 3.5 years reporting there during the heart of the American occupation and the war, which was 2003 to 2007. And leaving Iraq, I left deeply disillusioned with American foreign policy and the ways that America exercises power beyond its borders. And when I grew up in the 1990s, I grew up in a suburb of Washington. In the 90s, many of us had this feeling that American ideology, this ideology of democracy, free markets, capitalism, it's all wedded together, was the dominant ideology in the world.
Post-Cold War.
Yeah, post-Cold War, American triumphalism, the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama at Stanford said. So I thought that there was this inevitable march onward from that foundation. And instead, we entered the post-9/11 era, and what I saw was America being as brutal in some of its forms of power as any other nations had been throughout much of modern history. And we know that there are many instances in which America has done this, notably the Vietnam War, which I think before Iraq was probably the worst exercise of American foreign policy since World War II in the 20th century. And but we still live with this illusion that it's not an empire, but it is. And then when I went to China, I actually went with some hope or some optimism that China, as it was becoming its rising power that would counterbalance America on the world stage, that it would be a superpower, but that it would find alternative ways of governance or the exercise of power that would present a different vision to what we knew of America. But instead, what I found when I reported on China, both its domestic governance and policies as well as its foreign policy, is that it is also prey to the same whims of power that the US and many other powers have been throughout the ages, many other great powers. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the Communist Party tries to put forward this narrative of China as a victim of imperial powers, of European imperial powers, of America and of Japan, starting from the late Qing dynasty. And that's true. It was a victim of the predations of those powers. But at the same time, China in that same era, the Qing Empire, was also a conquest power. And the Qing were these ethnic Manchus from northeast China who swept down into Beijing, interior China, took it over, and then started centuries of conquest that brought Xinjiang, Tibet, other places under its control, most notably in the 18th century when Qianlong was the emperor. And so what the Communist Party has at the core of its project, in my opinion, is a reconstitution of that empire. And it started that when Mao took over in 1949, and when he sent troops into those western frontier regions, including my father, and it continues today as they look at places like Taiwan and think about how they can bring it under communist rule. So all the flashpoints that we see between China and parts of the outside world or within its territory, Xinjiang, the Uyghurs there, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then further east up the South China Sea. These all fit within that framework of China trying to hold on to its imperial territories and then trying to expand it also. So that, in summary, that was what I was trying to present. And the theme of empires you asked, Clay, was never far from my mind when I wrote this and was always core to my idea of this book.
Yeah, and it's woven completely through. So in the 17th century, the Qing create this empire by conquering all these different terrains.
Right.
In the 19th century, outsiders, mainly Westerners, but also Japan, begin to intrude in.
Right.
And we get then the narrative of national humiliation and the need to preserve all this sacred territory. Let me ask you a question about the other big organizing principle that jumped out at me is the interplay between your family's story, principally your father's story, and China's story, but also how you manage to go from chapter to chapter, 1950s, 2009, 1960s, 2013. You have this kind of back and forth.
Right.
And that is really powerful. And I'm curious, was that there at the beginning, or is that part of creating this
Yeah,
book?
that's a great question. One interviewer earlier this summer described it as like a Christopher Nolan film where you've got these different timelines that merge at points and diverge at points, and you're trying to keep track of the chronology. But
This is much easier to understand than a Nolan film.
right. When I was writing the book proposal, which was 6 years ago, Clay, I tried to think carefully about the structure. And the structure that I have in the book was actually laid out in that proposal, which is I would use my father's story as the chronological backbone of the book. So that story goes from mainly from 1950 to 1962 when he's in the People's Republic of China and serving the Communist cause. And then I decided that the story of myself in China, my reporting China, which is from 2008 up until last year, would have to be non-chronological because you can't tell both stories in a chronological manner unless I had the first half of my book just my father and the second half just myself. So what I decided to is take elements of my story or my engagement with China that would thematically match my father's journey, which was a journey. He goes from Hong Kong to Beijing to Northeast China to Xinjiang, Central Asia, and then back to Hong Kong. So it's this very long and epic journey. And I would marry parts of my story to those chapters of my father. So for example, the opening of the book is about the Japanese occupation, invasion occupation of Hong Kong in December 1941, which catalyzes my father's journey into China because he and his family members are forced to leave Hong Kong and go to their ancestral village in southern China. And so I talk about his life in Hong Kong, the Japanese occupation, and then his flight to southern China. And the second chapter in the book talks about my first trip to Hong Kong, which is 1997, when the British Empire is about to hand over Hong Kong back to China. And that's my first trip to Hong Kong. It's my second trip to this greater China sphere I'd studied in Beijing in 1996. And I sort of wanted to bring out these thematic resonances between these two different eras. And part of I think the message of the book, which I think you find in many other works, including Viet's writings, is that the history is something that stays with us. It's never something that you leave behind, and it has huge ramifications for people who live through it today, the things that happened decades or centuries earlier. So, a lot of the nexus point that Hong Kong represents as empires meeting, China, the Qing dynasty, the British, starting from the 19th century, and then the Japanese in the 20th century, that has echoes up through the 20th century as China takes one empire, China takes control of it back from another empire, and then up until, of course, as we know today, as China asserts dominance over things like rule of law, free speech in Hong Kong in order to erase the vestiges of the British Empire and impose its own control there.
Yeah, it's an amazing technique, and it's really engaging. And it conveys that idea that the past is never far away. And in many cases, it's not even in the past. It's very much in the scenes. So we have that sense from this book. It's really astonishing. One of the early lines that stuck with me is that language and food, the most portable forms of nostalgia, bind you to places like nothing else can. And that comes through in your talking about your father and persimmons and Xi'an and meals and things like that.
Right.
But can you say something about the linguistic background of this? Because he comes from from Guangdong, studies in Hong Kong. They go back, hopefully to be safer. And then he stays and then winds up getting set up to Dongbei, to the extreme northeast, to Manchuria, to realize, actually, first he goes to Beijing and then on to Manchuria.
Yeah.
And then he's out in the extreme northwest and then trying to find a way out of the empire.
Right. To leave exile and come back
Yeah.
into the interior.
Can you give a couple of examples of language and food? Because there are several meals in this where you're
Right.
gathering in Washington and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on language and food, I think, are familiar to those of many immigrants in the U.S., which is you realize as you grow up that the things that seem most distinctive to the culture in your household that make you different than other kids in an American suburb are the meals you eat. Mostly, often prepared by the mother of the household in many cases, and then the language that you're speaking in the household. So, I mean, that's just something that I think became instinctual for me, this idea of language and food as I was growing up. And then as I talked to people like my father and interviewed him in depth for this book, I realized that there were many Proustian moments that he had in his recollections of China and his time in China, and how he clung on to memories of Hong Kong and southern China while he was out in exile in the Northwest, working for the military. And he would remember very distinct meals that he shared with his family or food. And for example, when he finally gets a chance to go back to southern China in the late 1950s, he spent all these years, more than a half dozen years now in the north, and out in Central Asia. He takes a train right back to the south, and he immediately after he meets his mother and family members in Guangzhou, he goes to get a meal of roast goose. And he says that was one of the things he still remembers today, like the taste of that roast goose on arrival in Guangzhou, because it was such a distinctive thing from his childhood in the South, and that he remembered and that he had clung on to as one of these things that he would see again if he made his way back to southern China. And so of course it is very much like Proust and these memories, and they evoke this entire world for you. I think that that's true for people who are making these journeys within imperial territories, but it's true also of people who've migrated out or been sent into exile out of those boundaries as well to places like America. And I think any immigrant can, that line would resonate with them.
yeah, thank you for that. The book is very much about your father, but your mother's there.
Right.
And so in 1984, Lang Ping leads the Chinese volleyball to Olympic triumph. And your mom says, we cheer for China because it's our homeland. But her relationship with China is different, and she's much more critical.
Yeah, even today she's much more critical than my father is. And one question that some people have asked me after reading a book is, the story focuses very heavily on my father's journey and doesn't have that much about my mother, though she does appear in the prologue and in a chapter in Hong Kong in the book. And that chapter summarizes her family story also. And the reason for that is because there's a age difference between them. They're 12 years apart. So when she was young, the revolution, the communist revolution, its overthrow of the nationalist government was happening when she was a very young child. And her family was a landowning family in Guangdong province. And very quickly after the revolution's success in 1949, communist sympathizers there in the South and in the village seized the family land, persecuted the family, and then they very quickly fled to Hong Kong. So my mother arrived in Hong Kong, the British colony, before her teenage years and grew up there and spent her adult life there until she moved to the US in 1971 after having met my father. So I knew I wanted to tell a story of the People's Republic of China, though Hong Kong would play an important role in it. And to tell the story of the PRC, I needed to really focus on my father because he's the part of my family that spent these 12 pivotal years in China and witnessed these many movements of history there. So I really focused on his story. My mother, because of that persecution that she still remembers vividly from her early years, she has a very critical look at the Communist Party. She never embraced the revolution's ideas, and she still talks very bitterly about what happened to her family. She says, "I don't even have a single photograph from my childhood because they took everything from us in that house." And she has visited the house since then with her brothers and sisters, and she has visited China twice now to visit me when I was living there. But she has no, not even any positive ideas about the reform and opening period that has taken place in China since then and the economic boom that followed. She still thinks the party is this unreformed, Leninist organization that planted within it are these seeds of paranoia, violence, and probably in her mind its own undoing sometime in the future.
We'll come back to the party, which your father wants to join, and is on probation to join. But maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the family background. So Wong Yo-kern, your father, and I apologize, I don't speak Cantonese, but
Wong Yo-kern in Cantonese.
And your grandfather was a very successful business person, had quite a lot of success. His father, this is part of the heritage, this traditional medicine business. And so he moved back and forth between the mainland and Hong Kong all the time.
Right.
And then your father has the experience of being in the first graduating class of Guangya School in Guangzhou, this boarding school, to graduate in the People's Republic. In the People's Republic. And he is committed to building a new China and on board and desperate to contribute.
Right. And so my father comes from a middle to upper middle class merchant family that was had its roots in the British colony. He was born there. His father, as you mentioned, had this herbal medicine business where he imports Chinese herbal medicine from mainland China to Hong Kong and then sells it in Hong Kong as well as exports it to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam and other countries. And as we know, there are many ethnic Chinese who live throughout Southeast Asia, and I think he has business ties with them. So my father and his one or two generations before him are part of this, in the 20th century, this transnational Cantonese, mainly Cantonese merchant class that can very easily move between southern China, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia. And I think that's very unique to the specific part of even Guangdong province where he comes from. It's not even necessarily province-wide, but it's this place, Taishan County or Toisan County in Cantonese, where many of the Chinese immigrants who have come over to America in the 20th century and to other parts of the world originate from this single county in China. They came over to build the Trans-Pacific Railroad. They started laundry shops, restaurants, and founded many of the Chinatowns here. They became a part of the sort of the blue-collar, lower-class Chinese migrant population here in the U.S. And so the people from this county are essentially the contact point between the Chinese empire and the outside world. And some of them, as I said, come here to be laborers. Others establish themselves as business people in rings around China, and that's where my father's father, my grandfather, had gone. And so they come from this middle-class family, and then the Japanese occupation forces my father to go to Guangzhou and Guangdong, and he goes to high school at this prestigious boarding school, and I think even today it's considered a prestigious boarding school in Guangzhou because his father can afford it. His brother Sam, who's 4 years older, also goes to that school ahead of him and graduates from it as well. And then during his time in high school, the Japanese have been defeated by then, but the Chinese Civil War has reignited, and you have the communists fighting the nationalists. The most pitched battles are taking place in northern China. So in Guangzhou, there's not fighting in the streets there, but they're hearing about the sweep of the communists as they make conquest after conquest throughout the north. And he also hears about the ideas of communism. And there are people in his school, including, he suspects, a teacher who were communist sympathizers, or maybe even secret members of the party. And he hears these ideas about overhauling governance of China, succeeding where the nationalists have failed. And I think many historians have judged there to be massive misgovernance by the nationalists during this time. They were not, as some Americans think, they were not a democratic or liberal force. They were an authoritarian force that had economic mismanagement. My father witnessed high inflation throughout Guangzhou. He witnessed the advent of or the flourishing of brothels and gambling dens. He also heard stories about corruption in the very top ranks of the nationalists among Chiang Kai-shek's friends and family members. So he believed that the communists, led by Mao, would overturn all this, would set China on the right course towards being an industrial power that can compete with Great Britain and the US. And I think in his mind, he became set on dedicating himself to that cause. Interestingly, his brother, Sam, who had graduated 4 years earlier, instead of thinking that way about communism, he gets a chance to take a scholarship to study in the US, which of course is on the other side of the geopolitical divide. And he then leaves Guangzhou for Hong Kong and comes to Washington, where he studies at George Washington University as an engineer. Eventually, soon after graduating, he works first for the US Army for a few years and then for the US Navy for 3 decades as an engineer. So he ends up working for the military that my father eventually decides he wants to fight on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, and so Uncle Sam is a fascinating character in this book also, and you're the second historian in the family.
Right, he's the first.
He's the first, and you draw upon his memoir and these other things, and it's really fascinating that, as you said, your uncle is helping the United States, and your father wants to go to school, but then the Korean War breaks out, and he's ready to fight.
Right.
And why doesn't he get to do that?
He joins the military shortly after marching in Tiananmen Square in front of Mao on October 1st, 1950, the first anniversary of the founding of the PRC. He marches with students, soldiers, and factory workers there, becomes committed to the idea of defending the motherland in Korea, because at that time Mao's exhorting young people to help fight the American imperialists in Korea, and is telling people that if the Americans triumph on the Korean Peninsula, they'll probably come over to China and topple the Communist Party and reinstall the nationalists, which he wasn't wrong about that, because we know that MacArthur wanted to lead the American troops across the Yalu River, but that Truman pulled him back, and eventually the Chinese and North Koreans actually pushed Americans back farther south down into the Korean Peninsula. My father trains in the Air Force Academy in far northeast China.
So he's up in Harbin, yeah.
Near the Russian border, near the North Korean border. And he's training there, and then he is told that instead of going fight in the Air Force in the Korean Peninsula, he has to join an army unit that will go to Western China. And he knows something is going wrong at this point, because why would they not send a young man who's training for the Air Force to fight against Americans? But he doesn't know exactly what went wrong. And then as he takes trucks into Xinjiang, far northwest China, and to this vast land of mountains, steppes, occupied by Kazakh nomads, Uyghur Muslims, he realizes he's being sent into exile. He suspects it's because of his family background, that the Communist Party in these years is undergoing these massive campaigns initiated by Mao to seek out rightists, to seek out bourgeois elements, to seek out subversive elements throughout China. And he suspects that there's something about his family background, him being born in Hong Kong, him being the son of a merchant family there, and also his brother going to America to study makes him suspect. He doesn't know that, he doesn't feel affirmation of that until years later when he's working on one of the first military garrisons, agricultural garrisons in Xinjiang. He's working in the personnel department. He finds the file, the dossier that the communists and the PLA have kept on him. And in Chinese, this is called the Dang'an, and every Chinese citizen has one, but they rarely get the chance to see it. It's like the secret file that follows you from institution to institution, and only the people within the personnel department and others within that institution see it and make marks in it. And then he gets to read it, and it talks about the order to send him to the army instead of letting him join the Air Force. And he realizes at that moment that it is his family background that is the mark against him. But at the same time, in that same area in the mid-1950s, he becomes determined to prove himself to the party, to the military, and get back to interior China, because he still believes in the cause, even though he is not welcomed into the embrace of the party and the military. And he figures that if he can prove himself out there in this, one of the most arduous postings for any Chinese soldier, then maybe he'll win the approval and he'll be allowed to go back to interior China. And the plan works. He, one of his senior officers decides to help him apply or file an application for him to the party. And then he applies to enter university in Xi'an, in one of the capitals in interior China. And then he takes a long journey and bus ride back into China and goes to school in Xi'an, where his dream now in the late 50s is to study engineering to build military aircraft for the PLA. So he wants to realize the same dream he had earlier of joining the Air Force, but in a different way now, where he'll be an engineer who builds the aircraft that the PLA will use in its wars.
Yeah, he still wants to contribute to this, and there's a lot more that we could explore. But you're not the only father-son combination in this book. One of the interesting combinations that helps us move between the 50s and the 20-teens and the 2020s is Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping.
Right.
And there's some overlap, Xi Jinping's responsibilities, and certainly in the Northwest, but also Shenzhen. Maybe you could say something about that father-son.
Yeah, and that, I thought that was a really interesting element of that I discovered in my research for the book, which is, so Xi Jinping is the current leader of China, as many of you know, and has taken China in a much more authoritarian direction, and many of his policies have echoes of the Mao era. My father feels that as he watches what's going on now in China. But when my father was in China, serving in the Northwest region, the Communist Party official who was put in charge of policy for the entire Northwest of China was Xi Jinping, who is Xi Jinping's father. And the senior Xi was a comrade of Mao's, a very dedicated soldier who was fighting with Mao in the early days of the revolution, well before the triumph of the communists, helped set up a base in Shanxi province, where Mao would eventually seek shelter as he was being battered by the nationalist army. So he was a revered figure. Like this guy, Xi Jinping, was a revered figure in the communist pantheon, and Mao puts him in charge of the entire northwest of China. And so my father witnesses some of the policies that are going on in the Northwest through the lens of what the party elite, Xi Jinping and others, are ordering. So the policy varies year to year or every couple years out there in the Northwest in the 1950s. At times, they want to go hard on the the different ethnic groups that are out there. Sometimes they want to confiscate land on a large scale from, for example, the religious institutions, the mosques, the Buddhist temples, and they want to take land from the Kazakh herders, for example, appropriate it for the state, and they also want to disband the militias, which my father was part of that effort. At other times, Mao and Xi, the elder Xi, decide that they need to somehow politically win over the leaders of these groups, and rather than going hard on them, they'll loosen their grip. They'll refrain from these land confiscations and also executions of people that they consider insurgents, and instead they'll step back and hope to win the favors of the local leaders. And there's one year my father is in an army post there where he says he just sat around with an ethnic Uyghur soldier that was in his room. They sat around the post most days and didn't do much of anything, which for people who served in the military, that's not that surprising. Like, that's a big part of life in the military. But he said that they were ordered not to engage with the local people because this was a period when Mao and the LRC felt they had to pull back on the policies, and they didn't want a lot of contact between the ethnic Han soldiers and the Muslims and others out there. They wanted them to feel, the other groups to feel that they had much more leeway in their daily lives and in their freedoms there in the occupied Xinjiang. So that's an example of, for example, the role that Xi Jinping played there in the Northwest. And what I found interesting, as I thought about the narratives in this book, was that my father was living, experiencing these policies under the LRC and directly working for them. I was in China during the rise of his son, Xi Jinping, when he took power in 2012 and then implemented these much more hardline policies. And, of course, I wasn't working on behalf of the policies, but I was documenting them and the changes in China. And Xi Jinping, goes almost immediately into this hardline mode on Xinjiang, on this region that his father had once governed. And in Xi's policies, there was never, so far from around 2014, when these policies really start up until now, there hasn't been a let up on this very relentless imposition of assimilation. They're trying to forcefully assimilate many of the Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims into mainstream Han culture. They're trying to get them to suppress a lot of their Islamic practices. And they're putting, an estimated 1 million or so into internment camps. Some of those have been released since then. And at the same time, they're also putting many, many of them into the prison system in Xinjiang, something that isn't reported very often. And so he takes this very hardline approach to this region that his father had, and Mao had a somewhat nuanced policy during periods in the 50s, but then generally speaking, it has been in this occupied territory. And they've encouraged Han, throughout the decades, to encourage Han, ethnic Han from the interior to go out there, to start businesses, to be part of the military. And so there's been this very much a settler movement that moves out to the west.
Yeah, and early in your time, you actually cover the aftermath of the Ulamuchi riot, in 2009. You document that, and you've also documented, your father doesn't go to Tibet, but you do.
Right.
And you also tell or Greater Tibet, Qinghai, and you tell the story of this remarkable fellow Tashi.
Yeah. So one of the things, and you asked the question about language earlier, and I think that language plays an important role in the book, because not only is it a form of nostalgia and connection to your roots or to your original culture, but it's also, a mechanism of control as well. And I discovered that throughout my time in China, but most notably in these Western regions, because, and I met this Tibetan businessman, a very young businessman, in the town of Yushu, like the Chinese name is Yushu, and it's on the Tibetan plateau, it's a Tibetan area. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to petition local officials to open up or put in place in existing schools bilingual education programs where young Tibetans could learn Tibetan at the same rate that they were learning Mandarin. He believes that Tibetans should learn Mandarin because they've been absorbed by China now, and to get ahead in China, you need to know Mandarin. But he says we're losing our culture because we can no longer speak Tibetan. Like, I only learn because I enter a monastery and learn Tibetan there. But when I look around at my nieces and nephews, none of them are really speaking Tibetan. And so he believes that there should be this system and that there's a legal foundation for it, because in the Chinese constitution it says these areas like Tibet and Xinjiang should be fully autonomous, should be able to implement their own policies, whether it's education, economic policies, and that those policies should be able to be oriented towards preserving the culture or reinforcing the culture of these areas. So he's making a legal argument. He tries to petition local officials. They ignore him. He then makes a trip to Beijing to try and file a petition with the Central Petition Office in Beijing to tell the central government that I have this problem out here in far west China or in the Tibetan Plateau. He also decides to try and get the attention of journalists, including first Chinese state media, and then a friend puts him in touch with me, a friend who knows him, and a videographer and I then follow him throughout his efforts in Beijing. We go out to his hometown once he's returned there and meet up with him, and he tells us about the problems with education and this erasing of the Tibetan culture that's going on. And the Dalai Lama calls it cultural genocide. And when the story comes out a few months later, at first we're worried about him because he says, I insist on going on the record and appearing in this 9-minute documentary that you and your videographer are doing because I feel it's important that we have so many representations of the threat to Tibetans where there's an anonymous Tibetan being quoted in a story, but until they see a face and a name to this repression, people will not really understand what's going in Tibet. So he goes on the record. The first couple months, he doesn't hear anything, and there are no repercussions, but then he is detained by the police. He is questioned. He's after around a year to 2 years of being detained without any official cause, he is then put on trial and charged with trying to incite separatism, even though he says very clearly on the record in our stories that he doesn't want Tibet to be a separate part of China. He just wants China to abide by the legal framework that they've set up for Tibet.
And you write that he's channeling the Dalai Lama on that.
Yeah, he's channeling the Dalai Lama's policy, which is called the middle way. The Dalai Lama himself does not advocate for separatism from China. He thinks that Tibet should have
greater
the autonomy
yeah.
that has been promised to it from the Mao era onward and is enshrined in the Constitution. So he also even says, I think Xi Jinping could be a great leader for China. Maybe he'll understand all these problems we're having and institute reforms. But instead, the local officials, with the approval of the center, put him in prison. He ends up in prison for 5 years. And so it's one of the stories that I covered and one of the people I met on China that weighs very heavily on me because I think back about whether we could have done things differently, whether we could have made different decisions or he could have made different decisions that could have avoided this. But I think for people who understand the trajectory of where China has been going the last few years, it's pretty much unavoidable if someone wants to speak out against the system in these particular areas, especially in Western China. And after he left prison, he immediately went back to advocating.
Yeah, he's not a changed man.
Yeah, he's not a changed man. He's not broken by the system, and that makes me think that he was so persistent when he met with us in getting his story out and being willing to make that sacrifice and go on the record. And this is at a time when across the Tibetan Plateau, many Tibetans were undergoing self-immolation. They were putting themselves on fire and dying because they wanted to bring attention to their cause. And he decided that this was his way of bringing attention to the cause, and that I think he knew that a sacrifice would possibly have to be made, his freedom, and he paid that price. But he's back out there right now advocating for the same things.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and it's just one of the many that you'll find in this book. I have a dozen more questions, but we need to hear from the audience. Maybe before we do that, you would like to take us through
so I'll just,
some photos.
So
you can see some of the people and some of the places.
So this is my father in his red restaurant uniform, a restaurant called Champagne Cafe in the suburbs of Virginia. And as I say in the book, this is the only uniform associated with him until my 20s, when he showed me this photo. We were talking in my living room. I put this photo in the palm of my hand, and it's him in a PLA uniform
on the cover.
with a cap. And he mails this photo to his father, who is in Hong Kong, in the British colony at one point. His father gets it and rubs out the red star on the cap. And you see there's a black area there where his father had rubbed out the red star, because his father feared if the British authorities find this photo of a PLA conscript or volunteer in my house, then I might get in trouble. So, and then this is us growing up, a very American photo at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. And going back to my father's childhood, him in Hong Kong, the one on the left, and his older brother Sam, who would eventually work for the US military. And then he and his cousins growing up in Guangzhou, going swimming, which was a big hobby of his throughout his life, as they made their way through Guangzhou during the Chinese Civil War and going to high school there. His graduation, this is him in spring of 1950 when he graduates from this boarding school and decides to go north from the very far south, north to Beijing, and then eventually Manchuria in the far north. He used to train for the Air Force. But then, of course, is sent to the far northwest, where you see lots of mountain ranges. You're out there in the remote Asian steppe near Russia, near Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan.
There may be a pointer there.
Yeah. Anyways, it's far to the far, this area that we're talking about. And that's where the heart of his journey lays. It's 6 years out in Xinjiang, and many of you have read about some of the tensions and problems that have been arising in Xinjiang over the decades, but have reached a very repressive era in recent years. An interesting side note to this map, it's done by a guy named Jeffrey Ward, who made the Game of Thrones maps for the George R.R. Martin novels, and my editor just happened to know him and commissioned this map from him for the book. And this is what that area looks like in Xinjiang, the Kazakh areas where there are still many people leading a semi-nomadic life, and where my father served for those years. And this was on a trip that I made in 2014 to try and find out more about what my father's army unit had done out there. And this is in another area, Xinjiang called Wenchuan, where my father had served in one of the first agricultural military garrisons set up by the central government. It's a system that is known throughout China as the Bingtuan, and it's particular to Xinjiang. It is involved in lots of industry in Xinjiang. It's one of the biggest economic forces in Western China. It even produces things like tomato paste on these vast farms. And for example, tomato paste is exported to the West. You'll find it on grocery stores in here in America or in Italy, even in Italy, for example. So a lot of the products that come from this military garrison system end up in the West. And this is the only other surviving photo of my father in a PLA uniform, a summer uniform that was taken out there. And this is his years after leaving Xinjiang. And then this is his travel document that he gets from a police officer in Guangzhou that allows him to eventually escape to Macau and then Hong Kong. His family called in a favor to a police officer who then gave him this travel document in 1962 at a period when many Chinese were trying to escape to Hong Kong because of the Great Famine that ended up killing 30 to 40 million Chinese, Mao's misguided policies. And they're trying to swim across to Hong Kong, and many are dying in the waters between Guangdong province and Hong Kong. But he gets this travel document that allows him to formally go to Macau, and then from there he makes his way back to Hong Kong. He leaves Hong Kong in 1967 for the US, brings his grandmother, who's there turning 90, in a restaurant in Washington, D.C., the Jade Palace. This is where he first works as a waiter and eventually moves on to other restaurants. But it's a very typical photo, I think, of a lot of Chinese immigrant families in Chinatowns across the US in that era. And then I grew up in the suburbs of Virginia. Eventually, the family story comes full circle when I moved to Beijing in 2008 to work for the New York Times. And I stayed there for nearly a decade. And my father and mother visited me twice there. The last time is in 2012 when my daughter is born, and she's in the 31st generation of the Wong family. So that's the
IUA. Yeah. It's an amazing story all through this. And there's so much of contemporary China included, as well as US-China nexus. We've got John Huntsman at McDonald's in Beijing, and a whole lot more in this book. Time for your questions. We'll go over here.
Mr. Wong, good to meet you. Great talk. I bought the book here, and I quickly checked the index, and I was gratified to see that there is a mention of the Wakan Corridor.
Right.
That's on my bucket list of geopolitical places to visit.
Yeah.
Give us the full Monty on the Wakan Corridor. You know, roads, structures, whatever's not secret that you can share with
Okay.
us.
Well, there's a story I wrote for the New York Times on that in 2010, I think, when I made my trip there.
I
So
read
you can. Okay. So Wakan Corridor is a strip of land. I think this is part of the. It's one of these things that's actually a leftover vestige of empire, which is very interesting. It's a strip of land that. It's the one part of Afghanistan that borders China, and it's out there in the far northwest in Xinjiang. And it is a strip of land that juts out from Afghanistan into China, is bordered by Pakistan and China. And it's a mountainous territory, part of the Central Asian steppe, where many nomads, Kyrgyz nomads, live. Not Pashtun or Tajiks or other types of Afghans, but Kyrgyz nomads mainly. And I made a trip there, mainly out of curiosity, with my wife, Tani, and with two photographer friends in 2010. And we traveled the length of it, walking, sometimes riding horses. I just wanted to see what this piece of land was like. And I say it's a vestige of empire because it was created as a buffer zone when the Russian Imperial Empire and the British Empire, which controlled, as we know, Pakistan and India at that time, were meeting up with each other and vying against each other in what we call the Great Game. And so the commanders, the military officers of those empires and the officials decided they needed to create a buffer zone between these two empires. So what they did was they somehow agreed to create this strip of land that would separate British-controlled Pakistan, what we call Pakistan today, from the Russian Empire. And the Russians controlled that area of Tajikistan that is on the north side of the Wakan Corridor. So it fits into this idea of empire. I only mention it in one line in the book. I made a single journey there, but it is this very interesting example of how the decisions made by imperial powers have a real impact today on these countries.
But it's just an unimproved pathway? Is it a road?
It's a road. There's several villages along it. There is a road, and it was an awful road when I went to 2010. And then there are no roads at the eastern end of it. On the Chinese side, there are PLA posts, and you can't go into China from there. So I couldn't re-enter China I came in from Tajikistan and left via Tajikistan, but you can't go. It's a very undeveloped area.
So no Belt and Road activity?
No Belt and Road activity.
Michael Wu, who knows something about these villages too.
Yes, it's a great privilege to hear you speak today. I heard you being interviewed about your book, either on New York Times Audio or NPR or somewhere a few weeks ago, and it was very compelling. So I wanted to ask you a question. I share a lot of background with you, also from a merchant class family. My mother's side is from Toisan. My father's side is from Kaiping. And my father also went to a boys' school in Guangzhou growing up.
Wow.
So a lot, although my grandfather chose the other side, and after supporting Sun Yat-sen, chose the Kuomintang side.
Right.
But a question. In June, I was in Hong Kong and had an opportunity to share tea with your Times colleague, David Pearson, at the Foreign Correspondents Club. And we talked about a lot of things. One of the things we talked about is, what kind of role could there be for Chinese Americans? In the earlier decades, when there was more optimism that there could be a constructive engagement between China and the U.S., and that engagement with the U.S. and China might help to moderate China's tendencies. Now, that seems so naive. And I'm wondering what you think in terms of the current direction of U.S.-China relations. What kind of future role could there be for Chinese Americans other than being an apologist or a scapegoat?
That's a good question. I think that, there are many Chinese Americans who have a deeper understanding of China than, your average American because they've elected, like I have, to go back and live in China for a period to study the language, to study its history. And I think that if, there were more people who understood China on a deeper level within the American policymaking process, there could be some changes or more nuanced policy on China that I'm not sure that would necessarily take place because I do think that there are structural impediments to oftentimes nuanced policy within the American foreign policy apparatus. I report on that today, so I see it up close. But right now, there are barriers to greater representation of Chinese Americans within, for example, the State Department or the Pentagon or the CIA. One of those is that there are these criteria for getting clearance, classified clearance, that are often opaque, are overseen by the internal security units that operate within these agencies. And for very arbitrary reasons, they often say that, oh, this Chinese American cannot serve on any China-related issues or be posted to China. They think, their reasoning is that this person, there are certain things in their background, certain vulnerabilities that they have that will allow the Chinese government, for example, perhaps to exercise coercive pressure on them, perhaps recruit them for espionage. And I think a lot of that is overblown, and I wrote a story about this late last year, and there are people within the State Department, including this room, I think, who have taken very critical approaches to...
It's not a secret, Josh Shun.
Yeah.
I'm just hearing that story about the Chang'an and the background for your father.
Yeah.
And I never made that connection to what I am. Yeah. Just thank you for highlighting that again, both in the reporting you've done for the New York Times, but also here. But the connection that you discussed about your father being exiled and deemed not loyal enough to the Communist Party while he was training to be in Air Force, to this, there are very human similarities that I've noticed, and unfortunately I noticed about what's going on.
Yeah, and as you're mentioning, Josh, the process is secretive within these government agencies. You don't know what's in your file. It's very difficult, I think, to get a hold of what they've written up about you. Andy Kim, who's running for Senate now in New Jersey, has been a congressman representing a district in New Jersey, has been one of the most vocal critics of the system, because he says when he served in the State Department as a civil officer, he was told, he arrived at his desk one day and got a letter on his desk and said, you cannot take part in any policy decision-making or work in any units in the State Department that have something to do with Korea. And he had never even asked to work on those issues, but he had been told that he was barred from doing that, and he had no idea why. Like, even today, he's still puzzled as to why he was given that letter, and he's become a big critic of this very opaque system that's operating. And obviously, people like you, people like Andy have this file on them, but no one knows what's in it. Colin?
Hi, Calla Weimer, former visiting scholar at U.S.-China Institute. Could you talk about what it was like doing research on your father in Xinjiang? Because inquiring into a former military person in Xinjiang, and you were also a reporter, so you had a status that you wouldn't have wanted to compromise. So how did you get your way into that, and what obstacles did you overcome?
So there were moments when I tried to make specific journeys in Xinjiang. You know, I would be out there for reporting a story for New York Times, but then I wanted to take a few extra days and try and get to a place in Xinjiang where I could find out what my father's army unit had been doing out in that area. Altai, up in the far northern part of Xinjiang, on that border with Mongolia, Russia, and Kazakhstan, was one of those areas. And that was his first posting in Xinjiang. So I went up there in 2014. I went into the town of Altai. I knew that the police officers in Xinjiang are always on the lookout for foreign reporters. And if they know you're in the area, they often either follow you very closely or they try and chase you out of town. So I checked into the hotel, and I knew that as soon as I checked in the hotel, I would only have a few hours to try and find out what I wanted to, the information I wanted to get, because eventually at some point the police officers would find me. And so I went to the Civil Affairs Office in Xinjiang, which keeps track of a lot of the citizens that live in the area and works with military retirees. And I managed to contact a woman in the office, met up with her, and she was very helpful. She wanted to be helpful to me. She worked with military veterans. She herself is a retired Army officer, and she said, "Oh, I know people like your father often think with a lot of nostalgia about their time in the military. I want to try and find out more about this unit they served in." But eventually, she isn't able to find any paperwork on it. The police officers find me the next morning and chase me out of town. So I'm not able to get any information there. A lot of my father's story in Xinjiang comes down to the interviews I did with him about his time there. He's been very careful in his memories and saying like what he did, what he didn't do. And there was violence in Xinjiang in the times when he was out there. He says he didn't participate in it. There was, for example, the military suppression of a Kazakh insurgency that took place, led by this Kazakh named Osman Batur, and they captured him, executed him in public in Urumqi, the regional capital, and then killed some of his followers. My father was more often involved in indoctrination and propaganda. He would take part in these meetings, for example, in Altai on a Kazakh military base, where they would have Kazakh militia soldiers come into a room and listen to Han officers talk about the ideals of communism, about why communism could help both China as a whole and Xinjiang and the people in Xinjiang. So that was the type of work he was involved in. One interesting thing I came across in research were letters that he had written to his brother Sam, a series of letters he wrote starting right after he left Xinjiang but was still in the PRC as a student, and there's another series of letters he wrote after he escaped to Hong Kong. And in one of the letters he wrote when he was in Hong Kong, he had a very interesting line about Xinjiang that he never told me in my interviews. And he said that when he went out to Xinjiang, he realized it was this melting pot of different ethnic groups, and he counts around 15 different ethnic groups. They all had different languages, different perspectives, different ideas about the country and about their culture. But he says one thing that they all had in common was that they all had an intense hatred of the Han people. And it's interesting because when I was talking to him in my interviews, he never talked about these ethnic tensions that existed between him and the Kazakhs he met and the Uyghurs he met. But when he wrote this letter to Sam back in the early 60s, it was very present in the letter.
Was he sanitizing what he told you?
I don't think he
just the distance.
I think the distance. I think the decades that have passed since his time in Xinjiang, and he had subliminally, I think, whitewashed those memories, and like looks upon those years as ones of idealism and nostalgia rather than of grappling with these tensions that existed and that still exist today. So, for example, he would read my stories in Xinjiang on some of the violence and repression that was taking place out there, including the massive riots that took place in 2009. And he would say, "Oh, it completely puzzles me. I don't understand why there is so much conflict out there in Xinjiang today. When I was out there in the 50s, there was a lot of coexistence and friendly attitudes that we had towards each other. When in fact, when I look at these letters he wrote to Sam, it clearly wasn't the case."
Well, and as you say, he was involved in the propaganda side, finding model Kazakhs
workers,
and others to bring out.
Right.
Yeah.
Great talk, Ed. Thanks for coming to visit. One brief follow-up to the security question is whether the kinds of suspicions placed upon Asian American folks are also extended to people of other different kinds of national descent or potential national affiliations. I'm assuming that that's not true, that Asian Americans are subject to a higher level.
You mean within the U.S. government
Right, exactly.
agencies? No, there have been I think Muslim Americans, Arab Americans also face some of the same obstacles to being fully vetted and getting clearance from the security agencies. I heard stories about that, and in fact, there were these official directives put out in some of these agencies to telling people to be very wary of people applying for jobs there. And so I think that there were these internal hunts for questionable elements within the backgrounds of either applicants or employees within various government agencies.
So the usual suspects.
Right, yeah, exactly. And there could be others too, but these were categories I heard about the most during my research for this.
Now, about the book, the book itself, you mentioned empire. It's a core concept in the book. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate upon what it means to use that term and how sensitive that term might be for the different nations that you're dealing with. During the height of the enthusiasm about the American invasion and occupation of Iraq, the word empire became sort of fashionable again. I mean, there were American foreign policy hawks who were saying, well, yes, we are an empire and let's embrace it.
Right.
And then when the war started to go south, I think that idealization of the term disappeared. And so for you to write a book about the edge of empire as a New York Times correspondent, I'm wondering if that, even using that word, would somehow put you in a category of being supposedly biased, especially in your role reporting on the State Department and the Secretary of State. And likewise with China, I'm assuming it might be a sensitive term as well to talk about China as being built out of conquest and empire, and obviously still in the present moment engaging in these types of practices.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I haven't gotten any input from editors who have probably obviously read the prologue, where I am very explicit about the idea of America as an empire. I even say my conclusion from the Iraq War is that it was an episode of imperial bloodletting. But I also think that many scholars and historians who have studied American power projection overseas conclude that it's empire, and there's a very strong foundation for making that argument. They point to different things like the American military bases that are strung around the globe, the use of sanctions, the strength of the dollar, and how that's used as a reserve currency and allows Americans to impose sanctions everywhere. And so I don't think that's a controversial notion. I think that there is implicit within empire, there is a critique of that form of power too, especially in the post-colonial age. But I think we also have to be upfront when we see these imperial powers and call them out for what they are. And on China, I haven't gotten any reaction to the way I frame China from Chinese officials. In my email box, I get invitations to Chinese embassy events in Washington. I haven't been to any since the book came out, but I get these invitations. I wonder what they would say to me if I went there, but they're still inviting me to these events. I think I would still get a visa to China if I applied for one. China definitely does not call itself, I come across very few Chinese writings where a Chinese scholar will call the current day China empire, because I think that they strongly believe in the framework, the same framework that the party puts out, that China is the victim of imperial powers rather than itself an empire. Whereas, my argument is that it is one empire that contests power with other empires, and sometimes it's on the victorious end, and sometimes it's not. But also it's interesting because obviously my wife is Vietnamese American. I think that's we partly know each other through that connection, and my view of both America as an empire and China as an empire is also refracted through my understanding of Vietnam and her family history, because as we know, America in Vietnam in the mid-20th century was clearly undertaking an imperial war there. That was part of its greater project of the Cold War project that I had of asserting its imperial dominance over the Soviet Union, which itself was also an empire. And then, of course, China, through centuries, had tried to conquer, various powers located in China had tried to conquer Vietnam and absorb it into the Chinese empire. So you go to Vietnam today, you talk to many Vietnamese, and their biggest geopolitical fear is not predations from the West or from the US, but of course, what China might do to Vietnam and whether it is encroaching on Vietnamese sovereignty.
Well, and with that last comment about empire, where we started and ended at the edge of empire, I do want to close the conversation portion. Let our folks know that Edward's books are available in the lobby for purchase. He's graciously said that he'll stay to sign, take pictures with folks if you would like. So why don't you all join me in thanking Edward Wong and our co-host Clay Dube, the founding director, now retired, of the U.S.-China Institute. Thank you very much both for a riveting discussion, and we look forward to reading the book and learning more about these wonderful stories. Thank you all again, and thanks everyone for attending.